Okay, we are on. Erica, hello, hello, hello to you. How you
Hello,
doing?
thank you for having me.
Yes, may I introduce to you Erica Webb from Erica Webb Yoga and Pilates. And I'm delighted to have you here because we've been working hard on mindful movement, on just integrating movement into our mindfulness practice. And you are the go-to expert for this. So I'm really keen to hear what you have to say about it. Would you like to start by telling us what is your definition of mindful movement? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, so to me, mindful movement is a very big term. I'm a yoga and Pilates teacher, and so sometimes, people think of mindful movement and think, oh, it's only yoga. And that's not my belief. My belief is that any movement can be mindful if we bring mindfulness to it. And so, there's a way of being in your body that makes movement very mindful. Or we can do the kind of movement where, we're just sort of moving and doing something else at the same time, and we don't bring a lot of attention to what we're doing. So to me, any kind of movement can be mindful, whether you're it's really mindful if you're rock climbing because you've got to think about it. But yoga, we can walk really mindfully, we can run really mindfully. It can be the simplest movements to stuff that's more complex, but it's kind of that quality that we bring to it.
Mm. Do you know, I do work with a lot of people who teach meditation, and they tend to use that term a fair bit. But I've never heard anybody outside that sphere use the term mindful movement. So I'm really curious as to how you got into this space and why you specialize in it, because that's kind of the name of your whole business. So I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question, actually. No one's ever asked me that. I started off as a yoga teacher, and then I went on to study something else called somatic exercise, which is not very well known particularly in Australia, but anywhere. And then I also went on and got my mat Pilates certification. And so I never felt like I fit into one kind of like mold, I suppose, when it came to movement. And I'm not a purist by any stretch of the imagination, and I'm not very much of a traditionalist. So my classes don't look like, pure yoga or Pilates. And so I was looking for a different way to describe what I did, because yoga didn't quite encompass it entirely, and neither did either of the other modalities. And I was looking for something that kind of sort of bridge the gap, I suppose, between them all. And to me, what brings them all together is that it's mindful movement. And that was a really important distinction to me, because for me, mindful movement is inherently kind as well. And so, I think that a modality in and of itself isn't necessarily inherently kind, but I think being mindful of what we're doing brings a level of kindness to a practice that might be missing otherwise, because it allows us to be very aware of what is going on and aware of our inner voice while we do it. And so that element is really important to me. There's, this sense of getting to understand ourselves better through the process of moving mindfully. And so that term, I guess, is also trying to encompass that relationship between the body and the mind as well.
Beautiful. I have a lovely word to describe exactly what you're talking about. It's not my word. I did not invent it. It's a word used by John Kabat-Zinn. He talks about kindfulness.
Yes.
So it's a combination of mindfulness and kindness that's generated.
Yes.
So I think it captures it really well. Why is that so important? Why is it important for us to kind of cultivate that quality of kindfulness or generosity to self?
For so many reasons. The first one, though, I think that comes to mind is that we are kind of judgment making machines, right? And, I know you know this, but our minds are kind of designed to categorize and judge. And so we tend to see things very much through this lens of good and bad and right and wrong. And we, without really realizing it, put that on ourselves a lot. And so you see that in the movement world a lot, where people will perhaps be doing something and it's like, oh, I'm not doing it well enough, or geez, I used to be able to do this and now I'm terrible at it, or you would be a better person if you could touch your toes, and all these things that when you pull them apart, don't necessarily make sense. But because we have automatically sort of judging brains, we do it without intending to. And so, sometimes I will often remind my clients to like, just check in. How are you talking to yourself right now about the fact that you're wobbling, or that, you feel tighter today than you did yesterday, and you're not happy about that. Because when we talk to ourselves in those ways without realizing it, it still has an impact. And so what I found was, and, I've got a history of not being kind to myself. And so I used my practice to start to play with that idea in a really almost controlled environment, right? Like it's not like, it's still real life, but it's on the yoga mat. And so I could be like, oh, this is really interesting. I'm really harsh on myself in this environment. So if I'm harsh on myself when I should be looking after myself, what am I doing, when I'm not on my mat? Maybe this self-talk is all the way through my day and all the way through my life. And so it gave me, and subsequently I've tried to help my students with the same thing, it gave me this sort of safe playground, I suppose, to work on just switching it out to something that was kinder. And I think that when we don't bring that element of kindfulness, I'm going to use that word, I love it. When we don't bring that element of kindfulness to our movement practice, movement can be very much a punishment. Depending on what the thought patterns are, it might be punishment for the fact that you're not good enough. It might be punishment for the fact that you ate more than you intended to yesterday. It might be punishment for the fact that you disappointed your mother. Like, it could be anything. And we do it without realizing. And for me, kindness to self is just so vitally important. And I feel like it's a missing piece a lot of the time. And you can kind of tell when you're using movement as a punishment because it has a lot of shoulds attached to it. And it's not a nice place to move from, when we can move and we can be like, how can I be almost like in awe of my body and my being? That is so much kinder than trying to like fix it.
Yeah. Beautiful. And so movement is really, it's all about connecting with your body. And as we know, the body talks, and a lot of people don't actually like their body. So there is that constant stream of judgment as you're undertaking a movement to kind of judge what the body is doing, and to kind of self-deprecating sometimes. Oh, you're too fat, or you can't move this, or you're too tight, or you're never going to be able to do it, or that kind of thing. Now, I'm wondering, what would be some, because the work that we're doing at the moment is about integrating really simple practices into our everyday, so minutes of mindfulness. And I wonder if there would be some good, useful tips, 2 or 3 little movements perhaps that people could do in a mindful way, that they that if you could encourage them to do that. Anything up your sleeve? I've put you on the spot there.
Absolutely. No, I talk a lot about movement snacks, and they're non-edible, but they are this idea of being able to fit these little mindful movement practices into your day with the intention of doing it to also shift tension. So not movement for the sake of movement necessarily, but movement that actually makes you feel better as well. So my number one is just shoulder rolls. And, we often will do these kind of like little kind of wiggles after we've been sitting too long. But when I talk about shoulder rolls, I'm talking about like really big ones. So movements that, you squeeze your shoulder blades together at the back, you move your shoulders towards your hips, you squeeze them towards the front, and then you squeeze them up towards your ears. And if you just circle 3 times in each direction, really slowly, mindfully, with curiosity, with kindness, we get the shoulder blades moving around on the back. And usually they're quite fixed in place because we're on the computer, or we're doing, we're writing, or we're doing whatever, and our shoulder blades stay fairly fixed, but we want them to be moving around. And so if you can start to like just get things moving, it feels good. You feel better afterwards. And there's a lot to notice. And I think that's a really good one, because it's quite a complex movement. Shoulders are really quite a complex joint. And so if you can kind of, like start to just be like, wow, it's really interesting. I skip a bit here, and then I can't find that part of the circle, and that's really interesting, rather than a problem. And you just sort of start to play with it. But I like to think about any joint right? So anywhere you've got a joint, move it mindfully. You might circle your wrists. You might, circle your elbows. And this is simple stuff that will still make a big difference. Circling in the hip joint, circling your ankles. And we often dismiss these things because they are simple. And we have got for some reason, this idea that simple means useless. And simple is so profound because sometimes those simple movements, if we can do them well, they become the building blocks for what comes next. And so, we need to have this capacity to feel in our body. And those simple movements, they genuinely make such a big difference. And they help us to like build that muscle, I suppose, of noticing what it feels like. And sometimes when we start these really simple movements, like I'm not even really sure if I'm feeling anything or what I'm feeling, or, oh my gosh, that's so much tighter than I realized, or, whatever, we start to uncover some information that can be really useful. I love just sitting either on a chair or on the floor, straightening one leg or, almost straight, and just really, really slowly rotating the ankle. And the number of things you can notice when you do that in terms of how your calf muscle stretches some of the time, and then the front of your shin and the front of your ankle and down into your toes. And there's just so much to notice. It's hard to be bored if you're like, there are so many muscles and bones and things, just to get curious about the way that they work. So they're my tips. It's so simple. It doesn't have to be complicated at all.
Yeah, I love that. That's really beautiful, because often when people think of doing any sort of movement of the body, it's like, I've got to take it all to the end range of the motion and see if I can hold it there and feel the pain. And you've just broken it down into simple little movements. Wherever there's a joint, there'll be movement. That's so beautiful. And I did hear you say in your own way that it's really about focusing the attention, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And doing it slowly with curiosity. So there's an attitude that comes with it, kind of really lingering in that. That's so beautiful.
And the focus is actually really important, because our movement's controlled by our brain, right? Our nervous system is the thing that controls our movement. And so when we do it mindfully, that's when we get the opportunity for change that actually lasts. Whereas when we do it mindlessly and we're just sort of going through the motions, that connection isn't there. And so attention, I think, is vital, because it helps you to understand yourself better, understand what's actually going on in your body more clearly. It helps you to develop that sense of kindness as a result, but it also actually like taps you into your brain. And that's where we need to be in order to create a change in the way that we feel.
And so I'm wondering what recommendations you would have to somebody who's doing these movements but is experiencing like probably, unpleasant sensations or a whole lot of judgment, and they're kind of going, oh, I'm not even doing it right.
Yeah.
What would you say to that person?
There is no wrong. There is no wrong. I mean, I think it's really interesting when we take it back to something really simple like that. Where the movements are literally just joint movements. If that's unfamiliar to someone, and I'm going to tell you that's unfamiliar for a lot of people, because we just tend to stay in our train tracks, right? With movement, if you're not a mover, you tend to stay in your train tracks of sitting at your desk. You walk maybe to the next place, and then you sit in a certain way. And so we have these habits. And so it's important to differentiate between discomfort and pain as well. Sometimes novel movements feel weird because we're not used to them. And there's that moment of just like, what? What's actually happening here? Because you're just not familiar with it. That is very different to pain. And pain is a signal that your nervous system has decided that things need to stop because, you need to protect, it's trying to protect you. And so we always want to stay away from pain when we're doing simple things like that. But being okay with novelty is different to that. And I always say to people, if they find that judgment voice is coming up, just play with switching it out, right? So like, I'm so bad at this, could you just like for a second question if that is really true, and just switch it out for something else. And we don't always believe ourselves, right? Like it's, you might be like, oh, you're so wonderful. And you don't actually believe it, but you can still play with switching it out. And I think being patient, and I always like to focus on the end goal a little bit too. So if you're moving to release tension, or you're moving as an act of mindfulness, then don't be so worried about how good you are at the act. Be more concerned about, or not concerned even, but be more interested in just being curious about how it makes you feel. Because, you know, sometimes one movement that feels amazing to me might feel terrible to you. And so that's valid. Like, that's okay. Move on to something else. But, you know, that whole thing of don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, just because one thing doesn't feel good, it doesn't mean that you just give up. There's always something else to try, or dial it back a notch, or, you know, there's that sense of exploring. And every person is their own best like teacher and figure outer, because you're the only one with all the information about how you feel. It comes from so many different levels. And so, you know, nobody else can tell you that your experience of a movement is wrong. It's not, it's your experience. And so it's about learning to read it, learning to just respond to what you notice about yourself.
That's beautiful. So it's like the actual movement is data collection about your body and your experience.
Absolutely. In a very non-judgmental way. Yeah.
Which is the hard part, right?
It is. And you know what? It's always something that we deal with, because it's just kind of how we operate.
Yeah.
I know I still do it, and it's not the doing it. I always tell people, like, you know, they say, oh, I've started yoga. Now I realize how often I have my shoulders up around my ears. And I say to them, the fact that you notice that they're up around your ears all the time isn't a problem, because you're noticing it and then you can correct. And so it's the same, I think, with those judgmental thoughts when we're moving around on the mat or wherever. Just because you notice them doesn't make it a problem. The fact that you're noticing it is a really good thing, because it gives you a chance to choose again. Whereas I think we get stuck in the whole, like, why am I doing this? And it's like, you're doing it because you're a human. Full stop. But now you get to choose again. And that's where the power is, not in the, you know, other part.
I love that. That's really beautiful. So it's actually about the noticing and then choosing to stop it and choose again, something that's going to be more workable for you.
Yeah.
You have given us so many nuggets here. I love the mindfulness snacks. I love the fact that every joint there is movement. So it's not about doing a particular movement. It's just kind of looking at where the joints are and doing movements with focused attention, plus lots of other tidbits. Now, I'd like you to tell my audience a little bit about what you do, because you've got a virtual practice. Is that correct?
I do, yeah. Interestingly, before everything, I already had a virtual yoga and Pilates studio. I teach in person when things are normal as well, but yeah, I do run a virtual studio where we live stream classes, and I have a library of classes where people can sort of dip in and figure out, you know, what kind of practice might suit them on any given day. I'm not a traditionalist, so like this morning in our class, we used a tea towel as our prop to do some shoulder work, and so it's a little bit quirky but lots of fun, and yeah, that's how I operate.
That's good. I think everybody's got the tea towel, as long as you don't have to go out and buy some special piece of equipment.
Exactly. I was like, just trust me on this one. I promise it'll be okay.
And I must compliment you on your studio. I mean, that just
Thank you.
So beautiful. I just want to go into the screen and engage.
Yes,
and
it's the best room. I love it. I love this space so much. It's lovely.
Yeah. Now, if people wanted to find you and join your classes or have a look at what you do.
Yeah, so I talk about movement snacks a lot on my social media. So there's lots of little, like, if you're thinking, oh, this sounds good, but I actually really need to see some of this stuff in action. My Facebook and Instagram, I share heaps of them. So I'm at Erica Webb Yoga on both platforms. And my website is ericawebbyoga.com.au, and that's got all the information about my virtual studio and other stuff, and yeah, always happy to chat with people as well to see if it's a good fit.
That is beautiful. Thank you. I love the name because it's simple, it's memorable. I'm sure you know
exactly what you're getting.
And I just want to thank you as well for all the little gems that you've just given to my audience. I know I've got personal takeaways that I'm going to go and think about a bit now.
Fantastic.
So thank you so much for your time. And hopefully we can talk again one day. Who knows?
I'd love that. Thank you so much for having me. So lovely to chat.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.